This is 911. What's your emergency? There are 43 dogs howling at the same time, and I think someone is orchestrating this. The panic in Margaret Thornfield's voice cut through the October night like a rusty knife. Standing barefoot on her immaculate lawn at 11:47 p.m., clutching her iPhone with one hand and gesturing wildly at the darkness with the other, she looked like a woman witnessing the apocalypse. And in a way, she was. The sound rolling across Willowbrook Estates wasn't just noise, it was the opening note of her downfall. A carefully orchestrated symphony of revenge that had been 3 months in the making. What you're about to hear is the story of how one woman's obsession with absolute control turned a peaceful suburban neighborhood into a battleground. Where are you listening from tonight? I guarantee your HOA has never seen anything like what happened here. But let's rewind to where this all began, because the night of the great howling didn't start with dogs. It started with a woman who believed that homeowners associations were her personal kingdom and neighbors were subjects to be ruled. 3 months earlier, I was just another resident of Willowbrook Estates, the kind of planned community where every mailbox is regulation black, every lawn is exactly 2 3/4 inches tall, and every fence post is measured to the millimeter. I'd moved here with my golden retriever Charlie after my divorce, looking for the kind of quiet suburban life where the biggest drama was whether someone's garbage cans were visible from the street after pickup day. Charlie was 7 years old, house-trained, and had the kind of gentle temperament that made children gravitate toward him at the neighborhood park. His only crime was being a dog who occasionally barked. And I mean occasionally, maybe twice a week, usually when the mail carrier approached or when a squirrel had the audacity to exist in his general vicinity. The first time I met Margaret Thornfield, she was standing on my front porch at 7:23 a.m. on a Monday morning, dressed in what I can only describe as suburban battle armor. Pressed khakis, a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, and a clipboard that she wielded like a weapon. She was somewhere in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. Her pale blue eyes scanned my property with the intensity of a building inspector looking for code violations. "Good morning," she said, though nothing about her tone suggested she thought the morning was good. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I need to discuss your dog." Charlie, as if sensing he was the topic of conversation, bounded to the door and pressed his golden nose against the screen, tail wagging in that universally friendly way that dogs have. Margaret took a step back as if he'd brandished a knife. "He barked yesterday afternoon at 3:17 p.m. and again at 4:52 p.m. We have noise ordinances in this community, and I've received complaints." I blinked, still holding my coffee mug and trying to process this interaction. Complaints? About Charlie barking twice? Excessive noise is defined in our bylaws as any sound above normal conversational level occurring more than once in a 4-hour period. She flipped through the papers on her clipboard with practiced efficiency. "Your dog exceeded this threshold yesterday, and according to my records, this is the 3rd incident this month." The thing about HOA bylaws is that they're written by people who believe that democracy means 51% of homeowners get to control every aspect of the other 49%'s lives. Willowbrook Estates had 47 pages of rules governing everything from the acceptable shade of beige for exterior paint to the precise angle at which holiday decorations could be displayed. Buried on page 32, subsection 12.4, was indeed a noise ordinance that technically classified my dog's natural behavior as a violation. "Mrs. Thornfield," I said, trying to keep my voice level, Charlie is a well-behaved dog. He barely makes any noise at all." "It's President Thornfield," she corrected, and I swear I saw her chest puff up slightly. "And the rules apply to everyone equally. I'm issuing you a formal warning today, but if there are any future incidents, you'll face a $50 fine for the first offense, increasing by $50 for each subsequent violation." She tore a yellow carbon copy from her clipboard and handed it to me through the screen door. The paper was warm from the morning sun and smelled faintly of her aggressive perfume, something floral and cloying that seemed designed to announce her presence from 3 houses away. That first warning should have been the end of it. A reasonable person might have thought, "Okay, my neighbor is a little uptight about noise. I'll keep an eye on Charlie and try to bring him inside if he starts barking." But Margaret Thornfield wasn't interested in reasonable solutions. She was interested in establishing dominance. And Charlie's occasional bark had given her the perfect excuse to flex her bureaucratic muscles. Over the next 2 weeks, I started noticing her more frequently. She'd drive by my house at different times of day, sometimes parking across the street and sitting in her pristine white Honda Civic for 10 or 15 minutes, presumably waiting for Charlie to make a sound. I'd catch glimpses of her through the kitchen window, and she was always writing something on that damned clipboard. The woman was conducting surveillance on my dog. Then came the second warning. Charlie had barked to a delivery truck once, and somehow Margaret had materialized on my doorstep within minutes, as if she'd been lurking in the bushes with a stopwatch. This time she brought backup, a thin, nervous-looking man in his 70s who she introduced as Harold Finch, the HOA's secretary-treasurer. "This is becoming a pattern," Margaret announced, while Harold nodded along like a dashboard bobblehead. "We've documented multiple violations, and I'm afraid the next incident will result in monetary penalties." "Multiple violations?" I asked. "You've issued 2 warnings in 2 weeks, both for single barks." "The frequency of incidents demonstrates a failure to control your animal," she replied, consulting a new set of papers. "Additionally, I've been reviewing your other compliance issues." My blood cold. "What other compliance issues?" Harold cleared his throat nervously. "Your garbage cans were visible from the street for approximately 37 minutes after the designated collection time last Thursday." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile a shark might give a seal. "Trash containers must be removed from public view within 30 minutes of collection completion, according to Section 8.2 of our community guidelines. That's another warning." I stared at these 2 people standing on my porch, armed with clipboards and calculators, treating my minor lifestyle infractions like federal crimes. The garbage can thing was ridiculous. I'd been stuck on a work call and forgot to bring the cans in immediately. But I could see the path this was heading down. Margaret wasn't just enforcing rules, she was weaponizing them. "Is there anything else?" I asked, though I immediately regretted giving her an opening. "Well, now that you mention it," Margaret said, flipping through her papers again, "your front lawn appears to be approximately 3 1/8 inches in some areas, which exceeds our maximum height requirement of 3 inches. You'll need to address that by this weekend." As I watched them walk away, Margaret's heels clicking against the sidewalk with military precision, I realized I was no longer dealing with a neighbor or even an overzealous HOA president. I was dealing with someone who had turned harassment into a science, who had weaponized the very rules designed to maintain community standards into a system of personal persecution. That night, I sat on my back porch with Charlie curled up beside me, listening to the sounds of our supposedly peaceful neighborhood. A dog barked in the distance, not Charlie, but some other poor animal whose owner probably had no idea they were living under the watchful eye of Margaret Thornfield's surveillance state. I scratched behind Charlie's ears and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be Margaret's victim, but I also wasn't going to fight her on her terms, trading warning letters and fine payments in an endless bureaucratic battle. If Margaret Thornfield wanted to play games, I was going to play a game she'd never forget. The question wasn't whether I could beat her. It was whether she'd even realize she was losing until it was too late.
The certified letter was waiting for me like a coiled snake when I returned from walking Charlie that Tuesday morning, its green receipt card fluttering against my front door in the October breeze. What kind of person sends certified mail to a neighbor living 3 houses away? Someone who wants to create a paper trail. Someone who's building a legal case. Someone who's stopped pretending this is about community standards and started treating it like warfare. I signed for the envelope with hands that were already shaking, because something about the weight of it, the official HOA letterhead visible through the plastic window, told me Margaret Thornfield had just escalated this conflict to a level I wasn't prepared for. You think you know your neighbors until one of them declares war on your dog. Then you realize you've been living next to a stranger who's been planning your destruction while you slept. But let me back up 6 days, because the certified letter wasn't Margaret's opening move in week 3 of our conflict. It was her checkmate announcement. The harassment had started small, the way these things always do. Little yellow sticky notes appeared on my windshield every few days, always perfectly centered and written in Margaret's precise handwriting. Dog barking observed, 2:17 p.m. to 2:19 p.m. Third violation pending. Or my personal favorite, lawn height non-compliance noted, correction required within 48 hours. She was documenting everything, turning my daily life into a series of infractions that she recorded with the methodical precision of a court stenographer. The truly maddening part was how she timed these notes. I'd come out to my car at 7 a.m. for work and find a violation notice for something Charlie had allegedly done at 3 p.m. the previous day. Either Margaret was conducting round-the-clock surveillance, or she had recruited a network of informants throughout Willowbrook Estates. Given what I learned later, both theories turned out to be correct. By the end of that first week, I started keeping a log of my own. Not violations, just observations. Margaret drove past my house 17 times in 3 days, always slowing down when she reached my property line, sometimes stopping completely to write on her clipboard. She parked across the street on Thursday afternoon and sat in her car for 43 minutes, engine running, watching my front yard like she expected Charlie to perform some kind of criminal act. The woman wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was conducting psychological warfare. Then came the property inspection. I was working from home on a Friday when the doorbell rang at exactly 2 p.m. Through the peephole, I could see Margaret flanked by 2 other residents I recognized but had never formally met. She was holding what looked like an official document, and all 3 of them had the kind of serious expressions usually reserved for funeral directors. "Good afternoon," Margaret said when I opened the door, though she was already consulting her paperwork instead of making eye contact. "This is an official compliance inspection authorized under Section 15.7 of the Willowbrook Estates bylaws. I'm accompanied by board members Janet Kowalski and Thomas Chen to witness and document any violations." Janet, a woman in her 50s with streaked blonde hair and nervous energy, clutched her own clipboard like a shield. Thomas, younger and clearly uncomfortable, kept shifting his weight and avoiding my gaze. Neither of them looked like they wanted to be there, but Margaret had a way of making people feel like they had no choice. "What kind of violations are you looking for?" I asked. "Unauthorized modifications, landscaping infractions, exterior maintenance issues, and of course, any evidence of ongoing noise disturbances from your animal." Margaret stepped closer to the door, craning her neck to peer into my house. "We have reports of potential bylaw violations that require visual confirmation." The thing about HOA inspections is that they're perfectly legal if conducted according to the governing documents. Most homeowners don't realize that by signing their purchase agreement, they've essentially given the association limited authority to inspect their property for compliance issues. Margaret knew this, and she knew that most people wouldn't challenge her even if they suspected she was overstepping her bounds. For the next 30 minutes, I watched these three people measure the height of my fence posts, photograph my mailbox from multiple angles, and document the precise placement of my garden hose. Margaret narrated their findings into a digital recorder, speaking in the kind of monotone voice that court reporters use. Front lawn height varies between 2.8 and 3.2 inches, exceeding maximum standard in northwest quadrant. Garden hose stored in non-approved location, visible from street frontage. The most surreal moment came when Janet asked if she could inspect my backyard for unauthorized structures or noise amplification devices. Noise amplification devices. They were looking for evidence that I was somehow making Charlie's barks louder, as if I'd installed a sound system specifically to torment Margaret Thornfield. "This is harassment," I said, as Thomas measured the distance between my trash cans and the property line. Margaret looked up from her clipboard with the kind of satisfied smile that politicians wear when they found the perfect loophole. "This is community standards enforcement as defined by the governing documents you agreed to when you purchased your home. If you have concerns about our procedures, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with the board." "You are the board," I pointed out. "I'm the president of the board," she corrected. "Janet and Thomas here represent the community's interests, and they're witnessing a standard compliance review. Everything we're doing is properly documented and legally authorized." She was right, and we both knew it. HOA boards operate with broad authority to interpret and enforce their own rules, and unless a homeowner is willing to hire an attorney and fight the association in court, there's very little recourse for disputes. Margaret had positioned herself as judge, jury, and prosecutor in a legal system where I was presumed guilty, and the evidence was whatever she decided to write on her clipboard. After they left, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the yellow carbon copy of their inspection report. 23 documented violations, ranging from lawn height non-compliance to unauthorized decorative elements. Apparently, the small garden gnome Charlie liked to carry around in his mouth constituted an unapproved lawn ornament. Each violation carried a potential fine of $50 to $200, and at the bottom of the report, Margaret had handwritten a note. Cumulative violations may result in legal action and/or forced compliance measures. That night, I did something I hadn't done since college. I researched legal precedent. I spent hours reading court cases about HOA enforcement powers, reviewing state laws about property rights, and learning terms like selective enforcement and covenant violations. What I discovered was both terrifying and illuminating. Margaret wasn't just making this up as she went along. She was following a playbook that HOA presidents across the country use to systematically destroy homeowners who don't fall in line. But I also learned something else. Every weapon she was using against me could potentially be turned around if someone was clever enough to understand the system she was exploiting. The certified letter arrived 3 days later, on that crisp Tuesday morning when everything changed. I opened it standing in my driveway, with Charlie sitting beside me, completely unaware that he was the subject of what amounted to a legal death warrant. "Final notice. Compliance required," was printed across the top in red letters. Below that, 2 pages of official language that boiled down to a simple ultimatum. Eliminate the noise violations or face forced removal of the offending animal and potential legal action against me as the homeowner. But here's what made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the second page, Margaret had included a timeline. Failure to achieve full compliance within 72 hours will result in initiation of enforcement procedures, including but not limited to daily penalties, legal action, and coordination with local animal control authorities. She wasn't just threatening to fine me, she was threatening to have Charlie taken away. I stood there in my driveway, holding that letter, and felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd been carrying for weeks crystallized into something harder, something more focused. Margaret Thornfield had just made the biggest mistake of her bureaucratic life.
She turned this from a property dispute into something personal, and she had given me exactly the motivation I needed to stop playing defense and start playing to win. The war for Willowbrook Estates was about to begin, and Margaret had no idea she had just armed her most dangerous enemy.
"You're not the first person Margaret has tried to destroy with those clipboards," Dr. Sarah Chin said, watching me through her kitchen window as I stood frozen in my backyard, staring at Animal Control Officer's business card. I hadn't even realized Sarah was home, let alone observing my complete emotional breakdown from her corner lot. But there she was, stepping through her back gate into my yard, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of calm expression that suggested she'd been waiting for this exact moment. You want to know what it feels like to discover you're not alone in a war you thought you were fighting by yourself? It feels like oxygen returning to your lungs after you'd been drowning. Sarah Chen was about to become either my salvation or my partner in the most elaborate revenge scheme our quiet suburb had ever witnessed. 3 hours earlier, I'd been standing in that same backyard when the white animal control van pulled into my driveway. Officer Rodriguez was professional and apologetic, but he carried paperwork that made my blood freeze. A formal complaint alleging that Charlie posed a public nuisance and potential danger to community peace. Margaret hadn't just threatened to involve animal control in her certified letter, she'd already filed the complaint. "Look, I've been doing this job for 12 years, Rodriguez had told me, scratching Charlie behind the ears while my dog tail wagged obliviously at his potential executioner. "This complaint is unusual. Most noise violations we handle involve dogs barking for hours, neighbors losing sleep, that kind of thing. Your file shows isolated incidents, brief duration, normal pet behavior." He handed me his card and lowered his voice. "But I have to investigate every formal complaint. The person who filed this was very insistent, very detailed, and she's demanding a follow-up report within 48 hours. After he left, I'd stood in my backyard holding that business card like evidence of my own failure, wondering how many other pet owners had received similar visits after crossing Margaret Thornfield. That's when Sarah appeared, emerging from the shadows of her overgrown garden like some kind of suburban fairy godmother. "She went after my chickens first," Sarah said, settling into one of my patio chairs without invitation. 2 years ago, right after she got elected HOA president, said they were exotic animals that violated our residential zoning restrictions. I studied Sarah's face, trying to reconcile this information with what I knew about her. She was somewhere in her 40s, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of confident posture that came from handling large animals professionally. Her house sat on the corner lot where Maple Street curved into Elm, separated from the rest of the neighborhood by an elaborate garden that always looked like it was about to consume her front porch. I assumed she was just an eccentric homeowner who preferred privacy to curb appeal. "Exotic animals?" I asked. Sarah laughed, and the sound had an edge that suggested old wounds hadn't quite healed. 4 Rhode Island red hens in a regulation chicken coop fully compliant with county agricultural exemptions, but Margaret decided that chickens constituted a commercial farming operation which violated the residential-only covenant. She filed complaints with the county, the state agriculture department, and our HOA board. "What happened?" "I fought back," Sarah said. Her voice turned harder, more focused. "I had the law on my side, documentation going back 5 generations of my family raising chickens on that property, and grandfathered agricultural rights that predate the HOA by 30 years. But do you know what I learned during those 8 months of legal battles?" I shook my head. "Margaret doesn't fight fair, and she doesn't fight alone. She has a network of informants throughout this neighborhood who report back to her about everything. Who's walking their dog after 9 p.m., whose leaves their trash cans out too long, whose lawn sprinklers are running on non-designated days. She turned half our neighbors into surveillance agents without them even realizing it." Sarah stood up and walked to my fence line, pointing toward houses I could barely see through the trees.
Mrs. Patterson at 1247 Elm calls Margaret whenever she sees delivery trucks parked on the street for more than 15 minutes. The Johnsons at the end of Maple Street keep a log of every dog they hear barking, including timestamps and duration estimates. And Janet Kowalski, you met her during your inspection, she photographs every property violation she spots during her daily power walks. The scope of it was staggering. Margaret hadn't just recruited a few busybodies to support her complaints. She'd systematically created an intelligence network that monitored the entire neighborhood, turning routine suburban observations into evidence for her enforcement campaigns. "How do you know all this?" I asked. "Because I'm a veterinarian and I make house calls," Sarah smiled. But there was something predatory in her expression. Pet owners talk to their vets about everything: neighborhood drama, family problems, who's fighting with whom over property lines. Over the past 2 years, I've had 17 different clients mention Margaret's enforcement actions, usually because they were worried about their own pets becoming targets. She pulled out her phone and showed me what looked like a contact list. "I know every dog owner, cat person, and exotic pet enthusiast within a 10-mile radius. I know which animals have behavioral issues, which owners are struggling with training problems, and which pets respond to specific audio frequencies." Audio frequencies? Dogs hear sounds in ranges humans can't perceive. They respond to acoustic triggers, ultrasonic signals, even recorded calls from other animals. It's basic animal behavior science, and it's completely legal. Sarah leaned closer, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "What if I told you there was a way to make every dog in the neighborhood howl at exactly the same time?" The question hung in the air between us like a dangerous secret. I could hear Charlie inside the house, probably napping on his favorite chair, completely unaware that his owner was contemplating joining a conspiracy that would either liberate our neighborhood or land us both in legal trouble. "That's impossible," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Sarah pulled up something on her phone, a map of Willowbrook Estates with little red dots scattered throughout. 43 registered dogs in our immediate area based on county licensing records and my client database. Each one responds to specific behavior triggers, and most of them know me personally because I've treated them for everything from routine checkups to emergency surgeries. She zoomed in on the map, showing me clusters of dots around different streets. Dogs are pack animals. They communicate through vocalizations, and they're naturally inclined to join in when other dogs start howling. It's called social facilitation. One dog starts, others join in, and pretty soon you have a neighborhood chorus. But getting them all to start at the same time would require precise timing, strategic placement of acoustic triggers, and cooperation from pet owners who are just as fed up with Margaret's harassment as you are. The question is, are you interested in sending Margaret Thornfield a message that she'll never forget? I thought about the certified letter in my kitchen, the animal control officer's business card in my pocket, and Margaret's threat to have Charlie removed from the only home he'd known since puppyhood. I thought about her network of informants, her systematic harassment campaign, and the way she'd turned our neighborhood into her personal police state. "What kind of message?" I asked. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since this whole conflict began, I felt like I was talking to someone who understood that Margaret Thornfield wasn't just enforcing rules, she was waging psychological warfare against anyone who refused to submit to her authority. The kind that lets her know she's not the only one in this neighborhood who understands how to organize a campaign, and the kind that makes her realize she picked the wrong fight with the wrong people. As the sun set behind Sarah's overgrown garden, casting long shadows across my backyard, I made the decision that would transform me from Margaret's victim to her worst nightmare. The war for Willowbrook Estates was about to become a very different kind of battle, and Margaret had no idea she was about to face an enemy who understood her own tactics better than she did.
The thorns from Mrs. Peterson's prize-winning roses were shredding my jacket as I crouched in her garden at 2:17 a.m., installing a device no bigger than a matchbox beneath her porch light. Motion activated. Frequency range optimized for canine auditory response. Battery life 6 weeks, Sarah had explained when she handed me the first unit. What she hadn't mentioned was that covert installation required the stealth skills of a cat burglar and the pain tolerance of a medieval monk. But as I pressed the tiny transmitter against the underside of the light fixture, securing it with weatherproof adhesive, I knew we were planting the seeds of Margaret Thornfield's downfall, one strategic location at a time. You want to know what real revenge looks like? It doesn't happen in a moment of angry confrontation. It happens in the patient accumulation of small, invisible preparations that your enemy never sees coming until the night their entire world changes forever. 3 weeks earlier, Operation Midnight Symphony had begun with a simple question. How do you coordinate 43 dogs across a half-mile radius to howl simultaneously? The answer, according to Dr. Sarah Chen's research, involved a combination of animal psychology, acoustic engineering, and what amounted to the most elaborate neighborhood conspiracy in suburban history. Sarah's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Dogs naturally respond to pack vocalizations. When one dog howls, others instinctively join in. The key was creating the right trigger at exactly the right moment across multiple locations simultaneously. She'd sourced a dozen small acoustic transmitters, originally designed for wildlife research, that could broadcast ultrasonic signals on frequencies dogs could hear but humans couldn't detect. The beauty is in the layering, Sarah had explained during our second clandestine meeting in her kitchen. We don't need to make the dogs howl directly. We just need to create the acoustic conditions that encourage natural pack response behavior. One dog starts, the signal propagates, and social facilitation does the rest. She'd spread out a detailed map of Willowbrook Estates, marked with colored pins representing each confirmed dog location. Red pins are the primary triggers. Dogs with strong vocal tendencies who respond predictably to ultrasonic stimuli. Yellow pins are secondary responders, pets who will join in once the primary chorus starts. Blue pins are wildcards, animals whose behavior we can't predict, but who might participate if the conditions are right. The map looked like a military operation, which, in a sense, it was. Our first recruitment meeting happened by accident. I was walking Charlie past the Morrison house on Thursday evening when their rescue pit bull, Tank, came bounding to the fence with his characteristic enthusiasm. Tank was built like a small bulldozer with the personality of a golden retriever, and his owner, Jessica Morrison, was struggling to keep him from jumping the 4-foot barrier. "Sorry, he's just excited to see Charlie," Jessica called out, grabbing Tank's collar. "He doesn't get to socialize much since we got that warning about excessive barking." My blood went cold. Warning? From the HOA president. Apparently, Tank barked too enthusiastically when the mail carrier came by last week. We got a formal violation notice and a $50 fine. Jessica's voice carried the kind of frustration I recognize intimately. "I've been keeping him inside during the day, but he's going stir-crazy." "Margaret Thornfield?" I asked. Her expression shifted to something between relief and anger. "You got one too?" Within minutes, we were standing in Jessica's kitchen while she showed me her own collection of violation notices. Tank's crime spree included barking at a delivery truck, noise violation, digging a hole near the fence line, property damage, and allegedly intimidating a neighbor's cat, animal aggression complaint. Each infraction had been documented with the same obsessive detail I'd seen in my own case. "The thing is," Jessica said, "Tank hasn't been aggressive toward anything in his entire life. He's afraid of butterflies. But Mrs. Thornfield made it sound like he was some kind of dangerous animal." That night, I called Sarah with our first confirmed recruit. Jessica Morrison wasn't just willing to participate in our operation. She was eager for payback against a system that had turned her beloved rescue dog into a documented menace. Over the next 10 days, the recruitment expanded faster than we'd anticipated. Word spread through the underground network of pet owners who'd been targeted by Margaret's enforcement campaign. There was Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, whose ancient beagle Snoopy had been cited for excessive sniffing during walks. The Williamson family, whose twin golden retriever puppies had received violation notices for coordinated barking when they played together in their fenced yard. Maria Santos, whose Chihuahua mix Peanut was apparently guilty of aggressive posturing toward squirrels. Each story followed the same pattern: isolated incidents blown out of proportion, normal pet behavior redefined as community violations, and owners who felt helpless against an enforcement system that seemed to design to eliminate animals from the neighborhood entirely. Sarah maintained operational security like a professional spy. She gave each recruit only the information they needed. Their dog would receive a harmless audio signal on a specific night, and they should allow their pet to respond naturally. No one except Sarah and I knew the full scope of the operation. The technology installations required 3 weeks of careful planning. Each transmitter had to be placed within optimal range of target animals, concealed from casual observation, and positioned to avoid interference from household electronics or ambient noise. Sarah handled the technical specifications, while I became the neighborhood's most dedicated insomniac, conducting installations between midnight and 4 a.m. when the streets were empty. Installing the unit at Mrs. Patterson's house nearly ended the operation before it began. She was Margaret's most reliable informant, documenting every violation with the dedication of a court stenographer. Her house sat at the corner of Maple and Elm, with clear sight lines to 6 other properties containing confirmed participants. The transmitter placement had to be perfect, close enough to trigger her neighbor's dogs, hidden enough to avoid discovery, and positioned to avoid activating her own ancient poodle who slept in the front bedroom. I'd just finished securing the device when her porch light suddenly blazed on, illuminating me like a deer in headlights. Through the rose bushes, I could see Mrs. Patterson standing at her window in a bathrobe, scanning the yard with the intensity of a prison guard. I pressed myself against the foundation, praying that her aging eyesight wouldn't detect my shadow among her landscaping. She stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 2 minutes, then turned off the light and disappeared back into the house. I waited another 10 minutes before extracting myself from the roses, leaving behind what felt like a pint of blood, but carrying the satisfaction of another successful installation. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her escalation campaign with increasingly absurd violations. She'd issued a community-wide memo about excessive pet odors that required all pet waste be removed from private property within 4 hours of deposit. She'd proposed a new bylaw restricting dog walks to designated hours between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. Most outrageously, she'd been conducting surprise wellness checks on pets, claiming authority to ensure that animals in the community were receiving adequate care and training. The wellness check at my house came on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before our planned operation. Margaret arrived with Harold Finch and 2 people I didn't recognize, armed with clipboards and what appeared to be a digital camera. "We're conducting a community-wide animal welfare assessment," she announced, though she was already photographing Charlie through my screen door. "This is Dr. Patricia Walsh, a consulting animal behaviorist, and Mr. James Morton, our legal advisor." Dr. Walsh looked embarrassed to be there, but Morton had the predatory smile of someone who enjoyed finding technicalities in legal documents. They spent 20 minutes documenting Charlie's living conditions, photographing his food and water bowls, measuring the dimensions of his dog bed, and asking detailed questions about his exercise routine, training history, and behavioral patterns. Your animal appears adequately maintained, Dr. Walsh admitted reluctantly, though we note some signs of potential anxiety that might indicate environmental stressors. What kind of environmental stressors? I asked. Morton consulted his notes. Insufficient socialization with other animals, limited outdoor exercise opportunities, possible isolation-induced behavior issues. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak. Charlie's anxiety was actually his normal response to strangers invading his home with cameras and measuring tapes. His isolation consisted of daily walks, regular visits to the dog park, and friendly interactions with every neighbor who wasn't part of Margaret's surveillance network. But the wellness check
At 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday, October 15th, Tank Morrison released the first howl that would echo through HOA history, his deep baritone cutting through the suburban silence like a battle cry. Within 30 seconds, Charlie joined in from my backyard, his golden retriever voice adding harmony to Tank's bass line. Then Snoopy's ancient beagle warble drifted across Elm Street, followed by the Williamson twins' synchronized soprano duet, and suddenly the entire neighborhood erupted into the most beautiful, chaotic symphony of canine rebellion ever orchestrated. For 3 weeks, Sarah Chen and I had planned this moment down to the second, but nothing could have prepared us for the raw power of 43 dogs howling in unison at the suburban night sky. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was revolution. And Margaret Thornfield was about to discover that some battles can't be won with clipboards and violation notices. The operation began at 11:30 p.m. when Sarah sent the activation signal from her laptop. 17 hidden transmitters throughout Willowbrook Estates simultaneously began broadcasting ultrasonic frequencies designed to trigger natural pack response behavior in domestic dogs. The sound was inaudible to humans, but irresistible to our four-legged conspirators who had been unconsciously trained by 3 weeks of gradual conditioning to associate these frequencies with their natural inclination to vocalize. I was positioned in my backyard with Charlie, wearing night vision binoculars and maintaining radio contact with Sarah through encrypted walkie-talkies we'd purchased from a hunting supply store. The military precision of our operation would have made Navy SEALs proud, except instead of infiltrating enemy territory, we were orchestrating the world's first coordinated suburban pet uprising. Signal transmitted. Sarah's voice crackled through my earpiece at exactly 11:45 p.m. Primary triggers should respond within 2 minutes. Tank Morrison was our alpha dog, the four-legged equivalent of a tenor hitting the high note that brings down the house. His initial howl at 11:47 was deep, mournful, and absolutely perfect. Within seconds, Charlie picked up the call and added his own voice, creating a harmonic foundation that other dogs throughout the neighborhood couldn't resist joining. The cascade effect was more dramatic than our most optimistic projections. Snoopy's contribution came from 3 houses down, his elderly beagle voice adding authentic pack authority that seemed to give permission for every other dog in the area to participate. The Williamsons' golden retriever puppies created a stereo effect from their corner lot, while Maria Santos's Chihuahua Peanut added unexpected percussion with his rapid-fire yipping. But the real magic happened when dogs we hadn't even recruited began joining the chorus. The German Shepherd from Pine Street, whose owners we'd never contacted, started howling from half a mile away. 2 houses over, a Basset Hound I didn't know existed emerged from his backyard to add his distinctive bay to the growing symphony. Even Mrs. Patterson's ancient poodle, who normally slept through thunderstorms, began contributing a tremulous soprano from her front porch. Through my binoculars, I watched lights flip on throughout the neighborhood as confused homeowners tried to understand what was happening. Porch lights blazed across Willowbrook Estates like Christmas decorations, illuminating residents in bathrobes and pajamas who stumbled outside to investigate the supernatural chorus echoing from every direction. At 11:52 p.m., exactly 5 minutes into our operation, Margaret Thornfield's house erupted in activity. Every light in her 2-story colonial blazed on simultaneously, and within seconds, she appeared on her front porch wearing fuzzy slippers and a bathrobe, clutching her phone like a weapon. Even from 4 houses away, I could see the panic in her body language as she spun in circles, trying to identify the source of what must have sounded like an invasion of howling demons. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" The first call was logged at 11:54 p.m., according to police records I would later obtain through a Freedom of Information request. "There are 43 dogs howling at the same time, and I think someone is orchestrating this." Margaret's voice carried across the quiet street, audible even over the continuing canine symphony. The 911 dispatcher, to her credit, tried to handle Margaret's complaint with professional composure. "Ma'am, dogs do sometimes howl together, especially if they hear sirens or other triggering sounds. Are you reporting a noise complaint?" "I'm reporting a conspiracy," she shrieked, pacing across her front lawn in her fuzzy slippers. "These animals have been coordinated to attack me personally. I demand immediate police response and animal control intervention." What Margaret couldn't see, but I could observe perfectly through my night vision binoculars, was that her own frantic pacing and shouting was actually encouraging the dogs to continue howling. Animal behaviorists call it excitement escalation, when human agitation increases canine vocalization. Her own hysteria was fueling the very phenomenon she was trying to stop. At 11:58 p.m., Margaret made her second call, this time to animal control. Officer Rodriguez, who had visited my house weeks earlier, was unfortunately on duty and had to respond to her emergency complaint about coordinated animal aggression. The third call went to the mayor's after-hours emergency line, where Margaret left a rambling voicemail about domestic terrorism involving weaponized pets. But here's what made the night truly perfect. The neighborhood's reaction wasn't fear or annoyance, it was wonder, and then gradual understanding, and finally something approaching admiration. Jessica Morrison emerged from her house at 12:03 a.m., ostensibly to quiet Tank, but actually to give him encouraging scratches behind the ears. "Good boy," I heard her whisper. "Sing your heart out." Robert Chen appeared on his front porch with Snoopy, and instead of bringing his beagle inside, he sat down on his porch steps and listened to the chorus with what looked like genuine appreciation. The Williamson family gathered on their lawn like they were attending an outdoor concert, watching their golden retriever puppies contribute to the neighborhood symphony with obvious pride. Even neighbors without dogs began emerging to witness the spectacle. The elderly couple from Maple Street stood on their front porch holding hands, smiling at the surreal beauty of an entire neighborhood full of animals singing together under the October stars. The young family with twin toddlers opened their upstairs window so that children could hear what would probably become their earliest childhood memory. By 12:15 a.m., the howling began to naturally fade as dogs grew tired or were gently coaxed inside by their owners. But the damage to Margaret's authority was complete and irreversible. She had spent 28 minutes on her front lawn, in full view of the entire neighborhood, screaming into her phone about conspiracies and domestic terrorism while surrounded by residents who were clearly enjoying the very phenomenon she was trying to stop. The final howl came from Charlie at exactly 12:18 a.m., a long, mournful note that seemed to hang in the air like the end of a symphony. As the last echo faded across Willowbrook Estates, an unusual quiet settled over our neighborhood. Not the oppressive silence that Margaret preferred, but the peaceful quiet that comes after something beautiful and unprecedented has happened. Through my binoculars, I watched Margaret disappear into her house, slamming the door with enough force to rattle her front windows. But scattered across the neighborhood, other residents lingered on their porches and in their yards, reluctant to let the moment end. Some were talking quietly with neighbors they hadn't spoken to in months. Others were taking pictures of their dogs, as if to commemorate the night their pets had participated in something historic. Sarah's voice crackled through my earpiece one final time. "Operation Midnight Symphony complete. All transmitters deactivating. How do you think she'll respond tomorrow?" I looked toward Margaret's darkened house, imagining her inside reviewing her phone calls to emergency services, trying to explain to herself what just happened, and probably planning her counterattack. But something had shifted in Willowbrook Estates tonight. The balance of power had changed, and everyone knew it. Margaret Thornfield had built her authority on the assumption that individual homeowners were powerless against organized bureaucracy. Tonight, we'd proven that assumption wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The question now wasn't whether she would retaliate. It was whether anyone in the neighborhood would still take her seriously when she did.
Margaret Thornfield's resignation letter arrived in every homeowner's mailbox on a crisp December morning, 2 months after the night 43 dogs rewrote the rules of suburban warfare. Due to personal stress and health concerns, I am stepping down from my position as president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, effective immediately, the letter read in Margaret's characteristic precise handwriting. But what the letter didn't mention was the series of events that had systematically dismantled her authority, one howl at a time, leaving her with no choice but to retreat from the battlefield she had created. You want to know what real victory looks like? It's not a moment of dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. It's watching your enemy quietly pack up their clipboards and measuring tapes because they finally understand they've lost a war they never should have started. The morning after Operation Midnight Symphony, Margaret had attempted to launch her counterattack with the fury of a general whose army had just been routed by a superior force. She filed formal complaints with the police department, animal control, the county health department, and the state attorney general's office, demanding investigations into what she termed coordinated domestic animal harassment. She hired a private investigator to document noise violations and installed security cameras around her property to capture evidence of the conspiracy she was certain existed. But Margaret had made a critical tactical error. By escalating her response so dramatically, she had revealed the true scope of her obsession to neighbors who were already questioning her methods. When word spread that she'd hired a private detective to spy on people walking their dogs, even her most reliable allies began to distance themselves from her campaign. The turning point came during the November HOA board meeting, which was held in the community center and attracted the largest attendance in Willowbrook Estates history. 47 residents packed the small conference room, most of them accompanied by their dogs, who sat quietly beside their owners like furry character witnesses. Margaret opened the meeting by presenting a PowerPoint presentation titled Restoring Order, a Comprehensive Plan for Animal Control Enforcement. For 37 minutes, she detailed her evidence of what she called organized pet-based terrorism, complete with charts showing barking incidents, maps of alleged coordination patterns, and a proposed budget for enhanced surveillance equipment. The response from the audience was not what she expected. Jessica Morrison stood up first, holding Tank's leash, while her rescue pit bull wagged his tail at the crowd. Mrs. Thornfield, I've lived in this neighborhood for 6 years, and October 15th was the first night I ever heard my neighbors talking to each other. That wasn't terrorism, that was community. Robert Chen rose next, with elderly Snoopy sitting calmly at his feet. I've gotten more positive interaction from my neighbors in the past month than in the previous decade. My dog isn't a violation, he's a conversation starter. One by one, pet owners throughout the room shared similar stories. The Williamson family described how their golden retriever puppies had become neighborhood celebrities, with children asking permission to pet them during evening walks. Maria Santos explained how Peanut's alleged aggressive posturing toward squirrels had actually made him the star of an informal nature education program for local kids. But the moment that truly sealed Margaret's fate came when Harold Finch, her own secretary-treasurer and longtime ally, cleared his throat and addressed the room. I've been thinking about this situation for weeks, and I realize that in all our years of enforcement actions, we've never actually improved anyone's quality of life. We've just made people afraid to enjoy their own properties. He looked directly at Margaret for the first time that evening. Maybe it's time we started asking what kind of community we actually want to live in. The vote to remove Margaret from her position wasn't even close. 34 in favor, 8 opposed, 5 abstentions. By the end of November, she had submitted her resignation rather than face the humiliation of formal removal proceedings. But the real transformation of Willowbrook Estates began after Margaret's departure, when the community discovered what was possible when people focused on building something positive instead of tearing each other down. The new HOA board, led by Jessica Morrison as president and Robert Chen as vice president, implemented their first major initiative in January. The Willowbrook Estates Community Dog Park was established on the very lot where Margaret had planned to build her Quiet Contemplation Garden, a sterile pet-free zone designed to provide peaceful retreat from neighborhood noise disturbances. Instead, the space became a gathering place where neighbors met during evening walks, children learned responsibility by helping care for community pets, and elderly residents found companionship among both two-legged and four-legged friends. The grand opening ceremony featured a ribbon cutting by Tank Morrison, who demonstrated his improved social skills by gently taking the ribbon in his mouth and pulling it apart, while his tail wagged with enough enthusiasm to power a small generator. Sarah Chen, the architect of our Midnight Symphony, was elected to the HOA Board's new position of Community Wellness Coordinator. Her first official act was establishing the Willowbrook Estates Pet Ambassador Program, which connected longtime residents with new homeowners through organized dog walking groups and pet socialization events. The bylaw changes implemented under the new leadership were revolutionary for HOA standards. The noise ordinances were rewritten to distinguish between nuisance disturbances and normal domestic animal behavior. Property inspection protocols were reformed to focus on safety and maintenance rather than compliance with arbitrary aesthetic standards. Most importantly, the new board established an appeals process that required all violation notices to be reviewed by a committee of 3 residents before any penalties could be imposed. Charlie and I became minor celebrities in our transformed neighborhood. During our morning walks, we were regularly stopped by neighbors who wanted to hear the inside story of Operation Midnight Symphony. Children would run over to pet Charlie and ask if he was the famous howling dog from the internet, because yes, someone had posted video footage of that magical night and it had gone viral on social media platforms devoted to suburban drama and pet appreciation. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months after Margaret's resignation, when I encountered her at the grocery store in the next town over. She was standing in the pet food aisle, of all places, holding a small bag of kibble and looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Getting a dog?" I asked, though I kept my tone friendly rather than confrontational. Margaret looked up, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely vulnerable. "My daughter thinks it might help with the stress," she said quietly. "She recommended a small, quiet breed." "Dogs are great for stress relief," I replied, and meant it. "If you need any recommendations for trainers or veterinarians, Dr. Chen is excellent, very patient with first-time owners." Margaret nodded, though she didn't meet my eyes. "I heard about the dog park. It sounds nice." We stood there in the pet food aisle for a moment, 2 former enemies who discovered that winning and losing weren't nearly as important as learning what actually mattered. Margaret had lost her war against the neighborhood pets, but maybe she'd found something more valuable in the process: the possibility of becoming someone who could enjoy life instead of controlling it. As I drove home that afternoon, past the community dog park, where Tank Morrison was teaching a group of children how to properly throw a tennis ball, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. Margaret Thornfield's campaign against Charlie was designed to eliminate what she saw as chaos and disorder from our neighborhood. Instead, she'd accidentally created the conditions for the most beautiful kind of chaos: the organic, joyful messiness of a community where neighbors actually cared about each other. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's building something so much better than what your enemy was trying to destroy that they have no choice but to admit they were wrong about everything that mattered. Charlie and I still take our evening walks through Willowbrook Estates, though now they're less about exercise and more about social visits. And sometimes, when the moon is full and the night is quiet, I swear I can still hear the echo of that magnificent symphony that changed everything. 43 dogs singing together under the suburban stars, reminding us all that the best communities are built on harmony, not silence.